We have the last portion of tonight's program on Jihad Watch. Did Muhammad exist? We're going to throw it to David. David, you've had 5 minutes to make your closing comments right now.
All right. Well, we have two hypotheses before us. We have Robert's hypothesis and we have my hypothesis. And each one kind of has something going for it, and each one has a significant problem. So Robert's view is that the Muhammad we're familiar with, not necessarily the Muhammad that Muslims believed in who actually talked to the angel Gabriel, but in general, the sort of Muhammad you'd read about in the Encyclopedia Britannica or something like that, that Muhammad didn't exist. And what Robert has going for him in this case is this big gaping hole where there should be all kinds of evidence about this person, and it's just not there. So we would expect to find evidence. We don't find the evidence. That's a problem for the hypothesis. The problem I see with Robert's hypothesis, as I've said, is that ultimately it requires me to believe that someone was inventing things, and they invented things that I just can't come up with any explanation. Robert says, well, it doesn't have to make sense. It might not make sense. Well, yeah, but I mean, if I'm just going to say, hey, this doesn't make sense, maybe it just doesn't make sense, then I've ceased trying to come up with a good explanation of things. So I'm looking back at these stories and I'm saying, is there any earthly way I can see people inventing these things? So at some point in history, Robert's story requires me to believe that some people somewhere were making a list of things, making a list of stories, writing their stories, and they say, let's say he had sex with a 9-year-old girl. Let's say he allowed his followers to have sex with captives. Let's say he allowed his followers to have sex with prostitutes. Let's say that he enslaved people. Let's say that he tortured people for money. Can I imagine a reason for inventing these stories? And the answer is yes, for those stories. I can imagine, since these were accepted in 7th century and 8th century Arabian culture, I can imagine someone inventing these things. But the list keeps going, my friends. And then I start getting to stories where, wait a minute, why are you telling me that he believed he was demon-possessed? Why are you telling me that he was a victim of black magic? Why are you telling me this guy's standing on a cliff about to jump off? Why are you telling me that he violated his own revelations? Why are you telling me that he married the divorced wife of his own adopted son? Why are you telling me that even though he admittedly wanted to die a martyr's death in battle, he was killed by a Jewish woman whose family he'd slaughtered? Why are you telling me these sorts of things? Why are these part of this story? Why were these added? And I can't come up with an explanation. Robert has offered some possible solutions. There is a possible reason, but when I think about it, I think, hey, I can come up with better ways of achieving that goal if that was the goal. So I am trying to make sense of these things, and I'm looking at the total picture and saying, there is no way anyone would come up with this figure Muhammad, to unite Arab culture. I mean, obviously these things were very embarrassing to the early Muslim community, at least in several of the instances. Why would someone invent this when they can invent other things that would make him look very good? And I don't see a clear answer to that. And so I look at the theory, and now I'm looking around for an alternative. What's the alternative to Muhammad not existing? Well, Muhammad existing. And so the question is, can we look at Muhammad and say, yes, he existed, and yes, he did some of the basic things that are attributed to him, and yet can we explain this big gaping hole? Why is there so little evidence? Why is there so few references to the Quran for so long? Why are there so few references to Muhammad for so long? And I think we find the answer in the Muslim sources. We didn't really talk about this, but in the Muslim sources you find that Muhammad, when preaching his original message, wasn't very successful. He won several dozen followers after about 12 years of preaching, several dozen followers. Not exactly a Billy Graham crusade. It's only when he turned to other methods, namely, people join me, we'll go out, we'll conquer the unbelievers, we'll rape their women, we'll take their booty, I'll take a fifth, you take the rest, this is how we're going to do it, and the religion grew like wildfire. But in the Muslim sources, we find these Muslims, these converts, constantly complaining, why aren't we getting more money? Hey, you said we'd get a bunch of money, why aren't we getting it? They're constantly complaining, which shows they weren't really interested in Muhammad. They weren't really interested in Islam. They weren't really interested in the Quran. They were in this to go out and conquer and fight and subjugate people and get lots of stuff for themselves. And so if these are the people really that went out fighting, this army of people who are concerned with war booty, then we wouldn't expect to find lots of information about Muhammad or the Quran because they just didn't care. And it may have taken several generations of people kind of brainwashing their children. Muhammad is the great moral example, and you must talk about him all day long. You must talk about the Quran all day long. it could have been several generations before that mindset set in. And so we're looking at these two hypotheses. I don't think Robert's hypothesis accounts very well for the embarrassing material. It accounts very well for the gaping hole. And the question is, does Muhammad's existence, can we account for this gaping hole? I think we can, just by understanding the Muslim sources, that there was not a lot of emphasis for a lot of people on believing Muhammad. The emphasis was on. So again, we're weighing the hypotheses. One of these hypotheses makes more sense to me than the other, and so I conclude that Muhammad existed, and that would be my case for Muhammad's existence as the best explanation for all the data. Robert and I, at the end of the day, we're working with the same data. It's going to come down to what we place more emphasis on. Do we place more emphasis on having early sources? Do we place more emphasis on the principle of embarrassment? That can affect our answers a little, but we are coming down to different conclusions here. That's my case for why I believe Muhammad existed.
Okay, thank you, David. Very good use of your 5 minutes. And at this point, we'll reset the clock for Robert for his formal final conclusion. Then we'll go to our caller. So, Robert, go right ahead.
Thank you. The criteria of embarrassment, I have indeed given explanations earlier. I'm not going to repeat them now for all the stories that David adduces as being so embarrassing as to indicate that they would not have been invented. There are various explanations as to why they would have been invented. And then there are some things that we simply cannot know. David says that, well, it's if something just doesn't make sense, and then I have an explanation that makes sense, I'm obviously going to go with the explanation that makes sense. That's perfectly reasonable. And in ordinary circumstances, that would be exactly what I would advise. But these are not ordinary circumstances. There is a great deal that is absolutely inexplicable about this material. I don't know if you can see this coin, but it is in my book, Did Muhammad Exist? And it is a coin from Syria from the 680s. And on one side, it says Muhammad. And on the other side, it's got a picture of a ruler holding a cross. Now, anybody who knows anything about Islam knows that Muhammad is supposed to have said that Jesus will come back at the end of the world and break all crosses. And the Quran says that they did not slay him or crucify him, but it appeared so unto them. Now, why, if the early Muslims knew that Islam abhors the cross and rejects the cross and is the enemy of the cross, why would they mint coins that said Muhammad and had a cross on them? There's just no explanation for that. We can surmise that the word Muhammad was being used at that time as a title, the praised one, and being applied perhaps to Jesus or perhaps to the ruler depicted, but that it was not clearly the prophet of Islam, or there wouldn't have been a cross. Also, I'm afraid that David, for all his marvelous argumentation tonight, entangled himself in a contradiction right at the end when he said that it may be that the followers of Muhammad were simply interested in conquest and in booty, and so they didn't really care about Muhammad. And so they went out and they conquered and they didn't talk about Muhammad. And that all makes sense. But then later, he said, after having it being drilled into them generation after generation that Muhammad is the excellent exemplar and the perfect model for human behavior, they started talking about Muhammad. Well, wait a minute. If they didn't value Muhammad, then why did they drill it into their children that they had to emulate Muhammad? And if they didn't care about what Muhammad said and did, so much so that they never mentioned him, then why did they save all this incredible proliferation of material about what Muhammad said and did, and yet never give any hint that they actually had it? I think that's far harder to believe than that Muhammad was a figure who was invented in the 8th century and the 9th century. If Muhammad existed, then the people who came out of Arabia and conquered, even if they didn't care about him, we're supposed to believe now that they put away these stories in a trunk somewhere and saved them or memorized them, but never mentioned them and never gave any hint of their existence until much later. That seems to me to be absolutely inexplicable. Why, if they saved them, would they not mention them? And why, if they didn't value them, would they save them? Also, we know that the early caliphs, according to Islamic tradition, Abu Bakr was such a fanatical follower of Muhammad that there was nothing that would shake his faith. And there are many stories about that in the Hadith. Umar and Uthman were second only to Abu Bakr in fanaticism. After that, you get Ali, the son-in-law of Muhammad. You get Muawiyah, who was the son of Abu Sufyan, who was Muhammad's great opponent who was defeated by Muhammad and then converted to Islam. Muawiyah was raised a Muslim. Why, in all this period, when these people who knew and loved Muhammad were the leaders of the Muslim community, and they were the ones who were supposed to be in charge of the Muslim community, they never mentioned Muhammad? Not only that, we have an inscription on an official building in Gadara from the time of Muawiyah that mentions that it was built during the time of the caliphate of Muawiyah. And yet it's got a cross at the beginning of it. Here again, Islam abhors the cross. If Muhammad had existed and taught that Jesus is going to come back and break all the crosses, and Muawiyah rather, grew up at Muhammad's knee, hearing these stories and revering Muhammad as a prophet, then he's going to go out when he becomes caliph many years later and make a public building that's got a cross on it? It's inexplicable. It's especially inexplicable if Muhammad existed. If Muhammad didn't exist and Islam developed later, then it becomes explicable. And so ultimately, while I think David has made the strongest possible case for Muhammad's existence, I have to, with great respect and with gratitude to him for arguing the case so rationally and also so politely, in sharp contrast to the venomous hatred that we usually get from Muslim debaters instead of reasoned analysis, I have to reject the arguments and maintain that Muhammad did not exist.
Okay. Well, Robert, thank you very much. And David, thank you as well. The timing is great.